Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. Named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. We've talked about objectivism before on this podcast, but it was fairly introductory, and we didn't get into the weeds about its values and limitations, what it did well and what it kind of misses out on. Go check that episode out. But today, on March 21st, 2025, I am excited to welcome Douglas Denial and Douglas Rasmussen to the podcast to talk about objectivism, individualistic perfection, and the differences between the two, where one goes wrong, where one doesn't, all that sort of stuff. They have written so much on this topic and so many others. Denial is a resident scholar at Liberty Fund, and Rasmussen is a professor emeritus in philosophy from St. John's University, and he's a senior affiliated scholar at the Center for Economic Inquiry at Creighton University. Together, they've written a lot on the subject, including editing a collection called The Philosophic Thought of Ayn Rand. They've written a lot, both together and individually, at the Journal for Ayn Rand Studies. Denial has even written a book on the subject titled The Fountainhead, an American Novel. This is the first time we're going to have two people on the podcast with me at the same time, so hold on to your hats, your horses, whatever you're going to hold on to. Welcome to the podcast, both of you. I'm excited to have you.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
So, first question. What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
For some reason, the thing that occurred to me, and then Doug and I talked about it, was manners. And it's not that your generation is unmannerly, it's just a subject that's never taught, never discussed, and never given a reason for thinking about. And in this day and age, it seemed to us to be an important subject, given all the acrimony that goes among all of us these days. And I don't know, so it hit both of us that this might be one thing that people have ignored that might be of value. And Doug, you might want to add something.
Yeah, well, I just give examples. Showing up on time for meetings, for dinners, dressing appropriately for the context. I know a lot of that can be viewed as just someone being an old fuddy-duddy, I suppose. But I think there are all sorts of things that we do that show respect for one another and understanding one another that helps to make conversation go, make social life much more amenable to one another. And again, this was a part of the educational system at one time, and it would be nice to see that emphasized again.
It's funny because I grew up in a time where we wore sweatpants to school and pajamas. No one would change. And even I did that. And I say that because now I get dressed. I take great pride in getting dressed for the occasion and maybe even going above and beyond.
Yeah, I'm going to probably get myself in trouble, but I remember showing on Facebook pictures of professors and hobos, and one was asked to choose which was the professor and which was the hobo, and unless you happen to know the particular people in advance, it was a very difficult thing to do. But again, that doesn't, I suppose, necessarily mean that you don't have manners, but it is, I think, suggestive of one of the things that's lacking in our culture.
Yeah, little things like people walk in front of you and don't say, "Excuse me." I don't know, just simple little things like that seem to be common.
Also, I suppose a failure, and this will get us into other themes, to understand that one has to be responsible not only for one's life in terms of making it something worthwhile, but for how one deals with others and making that process something that is conducive to yourself and the other's well-being. It's it's minimal respect, minimal like recognition of moral responsibility.
Well, so that perfect segue. Could you both, or one of you, whoever, lay out for us just very simply, just to get into it, what is objectivism? And what is it that philosophy teaches, I guess is the way to put it.
Well, objectivism is the title Ayn Rand has given to her philosophy, and that's what her followers also use to describe what's the nature of her philosophy. She is, as you know, a philosopher novelist. She has many of her ideas posited through her literature, but she's also written a number of nonfiction articles, and mainly collections of her articles then get turned into books that are nonfiction. I'm going to let Doug give the basic doctrine of the objectivists, but it is a capital O objectivist that she has entitled her philosophy. The word is used in philosophy with small o to describe a certain orientation, philosophical orientation, which is not outside of what she wants. So Doug, go ahead and mention some of the elements of the document.
Yeah, I suppose I would just add that this is sort of a list that you get, and is taken really from looking at Rand. So this is what we'll call the basic tenets of objectivism. The first is that reality exists and is what it is, independent and apart from what one may know, and that one can know both the existence and nature of reality. This is her metaphysical and epistemological view. There's nothing unique about this view. This view could be called metaphysical realism, and it's a view that you could find in Aristotle or Aquinas, but she certainly has those tenets. The next thing you could say is that she looks at human beings as rational animals. There's more to being human than being a rational animal, but that would be the definition, I think, of what she would say human beings are, and the crucial starting point for her thinking about human action. In terms of ethics, objectivism would hold that we ought to pursue our rational self-interest, and that is the primary aim of morality. And from there, she has written a book called The Virtue of Selfishness and Other Things that has essays on that issue and the topic. When we get to political philosophy, objectivism holds that liberty, as defined and justified by individual rights, is the paramount aim of the political legal order. And accordingly, she holds that laissez-faire capitalism is as the expression of these rights, and that system is morally superior to other economic systems. So that's, I think, as brief as I can probably put the basic tenets of objectivism.
So what led you both, I mean, together and individually, to embark on this journey of dealing with her thought? I mean, you've mentioned she writes nonfiction, but to the world, she's primarily known as a novelist. And so how do you two, in dealing with what I might say is more formalized philosophy, why were you motivated to, and how did you end up engaging with her thought, and kind of folding it into the discipline of philosophy and kind of dealing with it?
Well, I mean, she invites that by calling herself a philosopher and telling us that philosophy is important. So once you sort of get into being interested in her, it's only natural that you pay some attention to philosophy. I mean, there's different biography between Doug and I and how we got there, but the two of us ended up in graduate school together, having had an interest in Rand and tried to make it more academic, shall we say. I don't know if you want the biographies, but that's how we first got together, was in grad school, and wrote a piece called Nozick on the Randian Argument. I think was the first thing we cooperated on. Since then, we've been together writing.
Yeah, it's there's probably we could both tell some interesting histories about how we got initially acquainted with Rand's thought, but going back to the first thing that Doug and I did together, Nozick on the Randian Argument, that was for a journal published by the University of Southern California Department of Philosophy, and Robert Nozick, the Harvard professor, had written a very interesting and powerful argument criticizing Rand's ethics. And we thought it was a very good article, but we also thought there were misinterpretations of Rand. And really, more importantly, I think from our perspective, the criticism that Nozick was advancing failed to consider what we would later call a neo-Aristotelian view of ethics. And so we started looking at that, and one thing led to another. And we came to the conclusion that Rand wasn't always as polite and as respectful of other philosophers as she should have been. And accordingly, that also meant that others didn't treat her that way. But we were concerned that there was a serious intellectual position there, but it needed to be considered calmly, carefully, and scholarly. And this led us to embark on the next big project together, which was getting the University of Illinois Press to publish a book of essays that we edited called The Philosophic Thought of Ayn Rand.
So I'm having a hard time figuring out where to begin. I mean, where do you see the values of her thought? Kind of along the lines of, like, if there is a serious academic, philosophic, intellectual position, what parts of that, what parts of that are borne out either in what you believe as being like a logical, valid, and at carrying water type of argument, versus where do her arguments kind of fall short? And we can get more into it into each. But just to begin, I guess, what about her thought ends up remaining after your analysis, and what parts of it kind of fall short?
Well, probably in my case, maybe Doug's, part of it was her political views at the time we were young men were quite antithetical to the sort of socialist doctrines that were being touted by people in positions. So for me, it was a liking of the direction she was going politically that got me interested in the other stuff. Maybe Doug started at the other end with the philosophy and ended up with the politics. I don't know, but probably typically people did it sort of my way because she got known for being a critic of socialism, etc. There weren't that many around at that time that were very good. She was not a conservative either, and my family background was conservative, so you're always looking into how much of what your parents tell you is correct or not correct, and that was part of it. Also, she appealed to the youth, sort of striking out on their own and doing things that way.
Yeah. The thing that struck me about Rand as I first read her was the realization that when you have in the American Declaration among the rights, the right to pursue happiness, is if you understand happiness as something more than mere pleasure, but as something about a worthwhile human life, that you living a worthwhile life, that you being the best you can be, to use that old expression, if that view is considered morally repugnant or morally secondary, if in general life is to be understood as sacrificing yourself to the collective or to the social whole, if you don't have a right to exist for your own development, then the case for liberty gets knocked down quite a bit. Now, I don't think the connection between the two are as direct as maybe Rand thought it to be, but there is, I think, in Rand an assertive of the importance of the individual human being that is seldom recognized in ethics, and I think that importance is crucial to understanding why a system that defends liberty is important.
So this is something I kind of struggle with because it's along the lines of her popularity. Obviously, she's like a relatively controversial figure. There are a lot of people who really don't like her, and there are a lot of people who like her a lot. But she does something in the way that she depicts economic decay and the value of the individual, things like this, where the imagery and the descriptiveness kind of brings it to life, I think. But on the other hand, there's kind of this criticism that her characters fall flat. And as I'm reading it again, Atlas Shrugged, I kind of see this critique come out more and more in that, like, there is something about some of her characters which are a little unbelievable, although some of the descriptions, even though what she's describing has been described by Hayek, say, there's this section where she talks about the importance of this big oil producer to the market and how his exit from the market has all these effects in all these different markets and on all these people's lives. And even though Hayek describes this and kind of the way, the interconnectedness of all these markets, it's so real when she describes it in this way. And maybe it's because it took so long for her to build up to the point where we could say that.
I think the reason it's so real is what resonates in her thought is the immorality of a system of coercion, the immorality of the business people using the government to get special interest, the whole idea that we can function in a society where one group in effect cannibalizes another, that moral angle that she has, I think that's what grabs hold of people, and she does that better, I think, than almost any person in classical liberal libertarian land. And regardless of what you think of her arguments or everything, that I think is just what resonates with people.
Yeah, and to put it in literary form also helps. I mean, we come at the world through our imagination first anyway, and she appeals to that and captures us, whereas, some abstract philosophical argument you may get to, but you're probably going to need some intro way to get there, and she provides it with her literary style.
So how did it complicate things for you both when you were dealing with her thought and kind of trying to parse through her arguments when, I mean, I think a lot of the appeal is the fact that it's kind of like an emotional, visceral. She captures this description well, but it's because it brings something out of the reader, which is not super. It's not super explicit. It's not very robust is maybe not the right word, but it's not a clear philosophical argument. So how did you deal with that? And how do people deal with stuff like that? Because she seems to mix like art and philosophy in a way that's wonderful, but that makes it then hard to deal with, I think.
Well, that's partly true, although I think for us, in large part, we found the images compelling and we wanted to look further into it. Again, youth has something to do with this because youth is at a stage where they want to individualize, find their own path of life and so forth, and she appeals to that right away. And in our cases, we decided to take her seriously and look further into her ideas. And both of us, at least, probably never paths to do that, but we both went into philosophy because that's where we thought the fuller development was to be found.
Yeah, I think the emotional pull of her thought points to something that maybe she didn't fully recognize, and that is that our emotions do give us a clue as to what is worthwhile. Now, of course, our emotions can be skewed the wrong way and all of that. But if you say, why does this pull on me so much? Why does this strike me as just on target, just right? Remember when people say that? You have to say, well, why do I think that? And what is behind that? And that invites you to the philosophical consideration, that invites you to think more deeply. And that's especially the case when you see people have the opposite emotional reaction. I've seen people read a passage from Rand and almost, well, I'm speaking metaphorically, they almost want to vomit. They have such a negative reaction. And so that's why you have to get into what is it that people see or don't see that's pushing their emotions. But the importance of that emotional tug or pull is, I think, vital for understanding yourself and the world around you.
It's funny because, well, so I mentioned before that I'm leading this reading group on Atlas Shrugged, and I've read it before a few times, but this is definitely the oldest I've been reading it, and also with the responsibility of guiding other people through it, which then means that I kind of have to, at least I feel as though I have to adequately show where maybe you could critique, where you could question, as well as maybe what she did right and well, and like where we stand now, whoever we is. And it's very odd because in a way I didn't when I was younger. I think I respond more negatively. I respond more negatively than I used to it. Because I don't know, there's something, age changes you, I guess. But I also think like I've marinated in these ideas a little bit and like seen them in action. So when we're trying to kind of think through where her ideas fall short, right? So there's this emotional pull, positive, negative. We want to vomit or we're like jumping for joy. Someone did it. Someone explained it well. I guess the way I want to go about this is you guys kind of come out with this idea of individualistic perfectionism, one or the other. And so what is that idea and how how does it differ from objectivism? They're often pitted against each other. So what is that kind of like interplay between the two?
I'll let Doug respond to part of that, but let me just go back a step. One thing about Rand is that she has views that you need to consider when you critique her. And the one I'm thinking, the view that she has a particular philosophy of art that you may not like, but she's very true to it. And I mentioned that in the Fountainhead. So, for example, I don't think I want to hang out with many of her characters, frankly. They don't seem like very fun people and so forth. I'm being a little facetious here. But they do fit her model of what she thinks she needs to do in literature to make it. So when you critique her, you have to be careful that you're also recognizing what she herself thinks she's doing in this. And that would be true of any philosopher or any thinker, that you need to be fair to them. You have to consider what they're trying to do or what they think they're trying to do. Now, objectivism versus individual perfectionism, just so your audience knows, perfectionism is a sort of technical term in philosophy, which involves typically a teleological dimension where you're moving towards maturity. Sometimes is a better word because people get hung up thinking perfectionism is to be perfect in some way, whichever they have. But that's really not what's going on here. It's more like maturation or fulfillment would be better terms. So I'll let Doug take it from there and say more about this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long tradition in ethics. I think it goes all the way back to Plato. Certainly, it's in Aristotle. You can find it in Aquinas. You can find it in people who talk about psychology today. It's sometimes called the doctrine of self-actualization. A contemporary philosopher by the name of David Norton wrote a book called The Personal Destinies, which is about this. And by and large, it's the idea that you need to create your character, create yourself into the type of person where you actually know what is good for you and you pursue it in a way that will allow you to be excellent. And you do that without having your emotions pull you away from it. One of the famous lines you can find in Aristotle is that the eudaimonic or perfective person or flourishing person is one about whom one can interchangeably say they're doing what they ought to be doing and they're doing what they want to be doing. Imagine that, to have a life in which what is really truly the best for you morally and what you want to do coincide rather than having this internal pull. Now, today, this type of ethic is, besides being called a perfectionist ethics, is also sometimes called a virtue ethics, which is meant to distinguish it from forms of utilitarianism or duty ethics. And so there's a whole set of things we could say about that, but I don't think we need to go into that. By and large, the important thing about perfection is, besides getting an acquisition of virtues, is going to be that human beings have to be moral agents, and their moral agency, or what we call self-direction, is crucial to the entire process. I suppose, I mean, maybe we can talk about this later some more, but I think also what is interesting about our account of individualistic perfectionism is that it's not an atomism, meaning that it doesn't think of human beings as existing apart from others. And two, it also recognizes that it's quite possible for one's good to be perfected when one does good for another's sake. And that's something that usually would be taken to go against egoism, at least as normally understood. That's sort of a brief starting point on this.
Yeah, that's good. The only other thing I would add is that individualism is an important dimension of the individualist perfectionism. What's good for you may not be good for me, and we're speaking ethically here. We're not saying you like vanilla and I like chocolate. We're talking about types of lives and things that people do.
Yeah.
They differ from one person to another and be perfectly morally sound.
Yeah, that's why we disagree very much with Rand's claim that she says that it's not possible for there to be conflicts between human beings regarding what is in fact morally right and good for a person. Now, the point we're getting at here is not that of a relativism where whatever one thinks or wants or chooses makes something good, but rather a situation where in determining what virtues and goods your life requires for yourself, given the type of person you are in that situation, can indeed conflict with another person. That can happen. The world, that doesn't mean it always happens, but it can happen. And that's important to thinking about ethics. So that leads to a discussion of how in ethics we have to learn to find the appropriate course of conduct for ourselves. And this brings us back to the old Aristotelian notion of practical wisdom and finding the doctrine of the mean, which, interestingly enough, unless I've missed it, I could never find in Rand's thought at all. Maybe it's somehow implied and someone can derive it somehow, but there's no explicit discussion of that. Anyway.
I think you're right that you can't really find any sort of like mean. I mean, people have always described Rand's thought to me as extreme and kind of an extremist philosophy in a sense. And I don't know if you both would agree with that, but it seems kind of right, at least upon face value for the most part, that she takes a lot of things to the extreme. And some things do need to be taken to the extreme, but...
Yeah. I mean, the thing I should say here is that the doctrine of the mean doesn't mean average. It means finding what is appropriate for you in that situation. And that appropriateness is a function of not only what you are as a human being, your basic needs, but also who you are as the individual you are. And so the whole model of ethics that tries to give it as a big set of rules that everybody must follow regardless of who they are or in their situation, that way of thinking about ethics is radically mistaken. And that's one of our views. And that's at times something that I think, Doug, come in on this if you want, I think Rand doesn't realize.
That's part of her extremism, is that there doesn't seem to be room for you. There's only room for everybody who acts like Rand wants them to. Aristotle's interesting in this regard because it's the me relative to us, he adds. So I may be prone to cowardice, but I can find a mean of courage if I work at it that may not be as strong as Doug's, but it suits me and vice versa. So there's a lot of individuation here. The individual is important in this regard. And if you take it seriously, it does lead you towards sort of the classical liberal political philosophy, because if we're really that different, we need space to do our own thing, so to speak. Hate to use a trite phrase, but that's part of it, and that implies that liberty has an important value to us. Doug might want to comment further on self-directedness as a central component of our view.
Yeah, I mean, what happens here is if the human good, human flourishing, perfection, if it's something real, but if it's always individualized, then to make human flourishing or the good the aim of the political order almost by definition requires that some version of the good is going to be sacrificed to another version of the good. Interestingly enough, that's a phrase, you can use a phrase from Rand called moral cannibalism here to describe that. But the challenge for political philosophy is how to find a fundamental value for the political legal order that will protect the pluralistic character of the human good. And one of the things that we've come up with, the major thing we've come up with, is the idea that virtue is a matter of our own self-directed agencies, or as John Cooper, the Aristotle scholar, said, eudaimonia isn't eudaimonia unless you've done it yourself. Okay. And so you've got to protect one's agency or self-direction. This starts having implications about when physical force or the threat thereof or fraud can be used. And this has has implications for our question about how a political legal order should work. And so that's a very quick way of getting at the political implications of individualistic perfectionism. There's a lot of details to that I've left out, though.
Yeah, but two things that you can say about the state. One of them is coercion that is actually directly against self-directedness. But the other is I lost the other one. Sorry, you'll have to. I know it's that the individual self-directedness means that the state, one of the tools of the state besides coercion that it cannot give up is universalization. It has to universalize everything. That's one of the tools the state uses. And that's not going to work if you're going to talk about directing people ethically in some way, because a lot of things cannot be universalized that are ethically dependent upon you as an individual.
Interestingly enough, there's sort of an economic common sense version of that point. People realize that, Ronald Reagan's line, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." One of the things people understand is that this assistance isn't going to be appropriate to themselves and their situation, and there'll be little appreciation for that. Now, that's sort of a practical reaction to it, but there's a moral meaning to that, and that moral meaning is ultimately one in which it takes the very core of basis for moral responsibility out of human action. Rand did say in an essay called "What is Capitalism?" This is a line I remember reading way back when I was in my early college days, to try to force or coerce the morals of a man or a person is like trying to provide somebody a picture gallery at the price of cutting out their eyes. And so, I mean, that's a sort of a livid example, but in a way, I think that gets at the idea here.
So I want to get back to the whole societal aspect in a moment, but something that really struck me when you both were talking about this is these ideas of being able to, of maturation and of self-directedness, that we are pursuing happiness. I mean, as was said before, that we don't know everything. And when you read her works, it's as though her characters don't discover anything. They're kind of static. And how do you and this is really an appeal that I think she lacks and that seems super present. So I'm kind of wondering what you two think about this in your work and your actual critique of this and kind of response as to how it actually does work, that we are growing, that without the growth, without the movement upwards towards something, we wouldn't be humans. It's almost a fundamental part of what it means to even be able to act ethically is to be able to learn what that means. And I don't know, would you read that into your work?
Well, one of the things that seems to be absent in her is development itself. Um, we don't see growth. I mean, these characters come out fully mature and fully self-perfected. So you don't see what struggles they went through. It's as if they're born a Randian hero kind of thing. And so that, I think, turns people off a bit. There's no struggle to be who they are. They're already that way. And that's part of her philosophy of writing also. She wants to depict the ideal, is not much interested in the non-ideal, but that's where development occurs. And it's important to realize that part of the thing that turns people off is the full dimension of humanity is not really a part of her literary style. And that gets people, I think, a bit off the track when it comes to looking at her stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I never really appreciated many of the Randian characters. I think the only character I really appreciated was Hank Rearden.
She doesn't even like him that much because he's not perfect.
Yeah, that's fine. That's probably. I also love the line where he's at Thanksgiving dinner where Philip Rearden, his nauseatingly sick, parasitic brother, says to Hank Rearden, "All you care about is money." And Rearden says, "No, what I care about is my money." I remember as a kid laughing about that for a long time. It is interesting though that. She does, in her more formal writing, talk about how knowledge is contextual, how that definitions have to be constantly checked and looked at, and omniscience is not required, and all of that. So, I mean, there's some awareness of that, but I think, again, this is the difference between trying to write philosophy and trying to write novels, and yeah.
So then, in terms of what the world looks like, what would a classical liberal, individualistic perfectionism society look like, right? So there is altruism. It's not atomistic, but liberty and freedom are an important part. This growth and pursuing the good is an important part. So in what ways politically and even just societally in the way that we engage with each other, does that world look different from the objectivist world?
Politically, I don't think there's a lot of difference in ours. I mean, we are trying to protect the self-directedness of individuals. I think that's what she's after as well. There are sort of anarchist wings of classical liberalism, more so than others, and she was certainly not one of those. So I think it's our picture politically and hers are pretty close. I think it's more in the other direction directions, I should say, that we have differences.
Yeah, I think also there's a point in Rand's writings where she'll say, well, this is a matter for sociology, or this is a matter for the philosophy of law, or this is a matter for this or that, and she doesn't say much about that. And I think those are some of the wiser moments when she's talking. I mean, it is in part, I think, if you believe in individuality, if you believe in self-direction, if you believe that the good is not one size fits all, then there's something strange about trying from one's armchair to describe what society is going to look like and all of that. I think that's a bit hubristic and rationalistic in a way that you don't want to be. It's what Hayek might have called constructive rationalism, if I recall that name. And I think one wants to avoid that. But again, since I did just mention Hayek, I do think that there's a huge difference between people that are inspired by Rand, or at least if they're not what's inspired by Rand, approach classical liberalism from a neo-Aristotelian background, between those and people in classical liberal land that do not, because there's a sense in which morality and ethics is really the fundamental game in town, where I think with others it's more economics and whether you're going to grow an economy and all of that. And of course, to say that is not to say either side should be without the other, but the point is what's primary.
So then, would you say that maybe one of the important differences is in the response to what we owe to each other as people, even if we can't depict exactly what society would look like, even if we shouldn't necessarily try to do that, in the way we engage with each other, in the way that we are together? Is that one of the key places where it differs?
Well, we might, as we've been talking, think that she's a bit incomplete in how we're going to deal with each other, that she doesn't have really that insightful a view of socialization, in my view, that we can get from others. So that would be part of it. But politically, we are interested in limiting what the state does very strictly and to very little. So the rest is going to have to come culturally. It's going to have to come from the actions of individuals, and we can imagine, consistent with classical liberalism, societies which have different cultures. They're not all going to look the same. They're not even going to define key concepts in practice the same way, what the limits to private property are and things like that. It might differ from one society to another. But she's a bit truncated in how people socialize, in my view.
I don't recall any really long discussion in her novels or even in her nonfiction work of family, children, the art of rearing children, that whole dimension of life.
Or even culture more broadly, I feel like is entirely neglected. Like the idea that America is culturally different from like France, for example.
Yeah.
No notion of anything.
Yeah, which is interesting because she certainly, in the Fountainhead, there's a spirit of what it is to be an American that's at work there. That is, well, it's certainly based on the political point, but it even transcends that. It's the idea of being a self-motivated, creative entrepreneur. Person that thinks that life is not a vale of tears, but something that is open to great possibilities, and that's at least a part of the American myth, if not the reality.
Thank you both for taking the time to come on the podcast and for sharing your work and your wisdom with me and with my listeners. I've really enjoyed it, so I know they will as well. I have one last question for you, if you have the time.
Sure.
That is, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why? Just one.
What I want to say is, it's not that my basic ideas when I was in my 20s, it's not that those ideas are wrong. It's just they're rather radically incomplete. And so there are dimensions to things. Just to give an example, I used to think that in order to figure out what the virtues and goods of the human life are, I had to somehow have a deductive argument from the proposition that man is a rational animal. And I tried to understand that way, and I came to the conclusion that that's a very improper way of conceiving of it. And if we had another 45 minutes, maybe we could talk about what that was. But in general, for me, it's been just seeing that there's so much more to the story.
I would hesitate almost to tell what came to me when you asked that question. Doug knows the story quite well, but I'll tell it anyway, and you can edit it out if it's too embarrassing for me. I was playing in a rock band for a long time when I was a teenager, and then my first year in college, I was getting heavily into Rand, and Rand suggested that rock and roll was anti-mind and anti-life. So I disposed of all my big collection of rock and roll music, only to realize somewhat after that this was a silly thing to do, that it wasn't Randian at all, because I wasn't thinking for myself. And damn it, there are excellences that aren't all the same, and you can appreciate different excellences. So it woke me up a bit, but it certainly has been a regret for how many decades now that I didn't have those albums. And I threw away or broke back then. So I don't know. That's what came to mind when you asked that question.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guests for their time and insight. I'd also like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. It means a lot. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests, or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at greatantidote@libertyfund.org. Thank you.